The wind was screaming like a wild beast that night, tearing at rooftops and ripping trees from the ground with merciless rage. Rain slammed against houses in endless sheets, turning streets into rivers and drowning everything in chaos. Power lines sparked in the distance, casting eerie flashes of light over a neighborhood that now looked abandoned, forsaken by hope. Inside those empty homes, families had fled to safety hours ago, obeying the desperate evacuation calls. But in the middle of this storm, forgotten and left behind, a tiny soul was fighting for life. She was no bigger than a loaf of bread, a young cat, chained by a coarse rope to a rusted metal post in a backyard that now looked like a war zone. Her fur was plastered to her trembling frame, soaked to the skin, each breath a fragile battle. The rope dug cruelly into her neck as she pulled and pulled, claws raw from clawing at the muddy ground. Her cries were so faint they almost vanished in the roar of the hurricane. Almost, because somewhere in the darkness, someone heard. You won't believe how this story unfolds, and when you discover who walked into that storm to set her free, it will melt even the hardest hearts. What makes a person risk everything for a creature they've never met? And why did this rescue turn into something far greater than anyone could have imagined? Stay with me, because what happens next will leave you stunned. This is not just about saving a life. It's about two broken souls finding what they didn't know they needed. You think you've heard stories like this before, but I promise, you haven't. This is the one that lingers in your heart long after the last word is spoken. So, are you ready to see how a single cry for help became the start of a new beginning? Let's go back to that terrifying night and follow the sound of that fragile voice. The answer to that call will take your breath away. Walter had lived on that street for 40 years. He knew the sound of storms. Hurricanes weren't strangers here, but something about this one felt different. At 64, with knees that ached from decades of hard work, he should have stayed inside like everyone else. His neighbors had packed their cars and left hours ago, their homes now dark shells, shutters rattling in the wind. But Walter stayed. Maybe it was pride, maybe stubbornness, or maybe because he simply had nowhere else to go. His wife, Ellen, had passed 2 years earlier, and the house had been unbearably quiet ever since. The laughter, the music, the Sunday dinners, all gone, leaving only silence. That night, as the storm hammered against his walls, the loneliness pressed down on him like a weight he couldn't shake. And then, he heard it. A sound so small, so fragile, it could have been the wind playing tricks. But it came again, thin and desperate, like a voice crying for mercy. Walter froze. It wasn't human. It was something else. And in that moment, the same heart that had been locked in grief for so long started beating for a reason he didn't yet understand. He grabbed his old flashlight and stepped into the tempest. The rain hit him like ice, soaking through his jacket in seconds, the wind shoving him backward with each step. Branches cracked like gunfire as he moved down the alley, guided only by that faint, heartbreaking cry. Every instinct told him to turn back. He was too old, too slow. This was too dangerous. But something stronger than fear kept him going. The certainty that a life depended on him. And then, his beam of light caught a shape in the darkness. At first, it didn't look real. Just a tiny mound of fur and mud, tied to a rusted pole like a forgotten toy. When Walter saw the rope biting into her neck, his chest tightened. She was drenched, trembling so violently he could feel it from feet away, her green eyes wide with terror. He dropped to his knees in the mud, whispering words she couldn't understand, trying to calm her as she flinched at every thunderclap. The knot was a cruel tangle, stiff with water and filth. His old fingers fumbled, slipping again and again. That's when he remembered the knife in his pocket, the one Ellen had given him years ago, engraved with his initials. With a trembling hand, Walter flicked it open and sliced through the rope. And in that instant, the storm wasn't the loudest thing in the world anymore. It was the sound of that little cat collapsing into his arms. Trusting him completely, he pressed her against his chest, shielding her from the wind as if she were made of glass. Her body was limp, so light it broke his heart. Walter didn't think, he just ran, boots splashing through water that now reached his calves, clutching her like a lifeline. By the time he burst back into his house, he was soaked to the bone, breath ragged, hands trembling from cold and adrenaline. He set her gently on a blanket near the fireplace, which he lit with shaky hands, praying the power wouldn't cut out before it caught. The cat didn't move much, just curled into the fabric, tiny ribs rising and falling in shallow breaths. Walter sat beside her, watching, waiting, talking to her as if words could will her to live. "You're safe now, little one," he whispered, voice breaking in the glow of the flames. And as he stroked her head with fingers that hadn't touched a living soul in years, something shifted deep inside him. For the first time since Ellen died, he didn't feel alone. But he had no idea this was only the beginning. The storm still roared outside like an angry ocean, slamming its fists against the windows. But inside Walter's home, there was a fragile calm, the kind of silence that holds its breath. The little cat lay curled on an old wool blanket by the fireplace, her fur still damp, clinging in tangled knots that spoke of her desperate fight for life. Walter knelt beside her, rubbing her gently with a towel, his hands moving slowly, tenderly, as though afraid she might shatter. She was so light it broke his heart. When he lifted her, it felt like holding nothing more than bones and fear wrapped in fur. Her eyes fluttered open once, green pools clouded with exhaustion, and for a moment they locked on his. It was only a second, but in that second, something passed between them. A silent plea, and maybe a promise. "You're safe now," Walter whispered, the words trembling as they left his lips. He didn't know if she could understand him, but the act of saying it steadied his hands. In a world tearing itself apart outside, this little creature became his reason to hold it together. And yet, as the night deepened and the storm howled like 1,000 ghosts, one question burned in Walter's mind. Would she survive till morning? He didn't dare leave her side. The old clock on the mantel ticked its way past midnight, each second slow and heavy, while Walter sat hunched on the floor, his back aching, his knees stiff, refusing to move. The fire crackled weakly, sending shadows flickering across the walls like silent witnesses to a battle being fought in whispers and breaths. Every few minutes, Walter reached out to touch her, to make sure the rise and fall of her tiny chest hadn't stopped. He thought of calling someone, anyone, but the lines were down, the roads were rivers, and the town might as well have been on another planet. So he did the only thing he could, stayed, watching, hoping, talking to her in a voice he hadn't used in years, soft, gentle, filled with something close to love. "It's okay, sweetheart," he murmured, even though he hadn't called anyone that in a long time. His Ellen had been the last person to hear those words from his lips. The thought made his throat tighten, tears stinging his tired eyes. For so long, his house had been a mausoleum of silence. Now, for the first time in years, there was life in it again, fragile, flickering, but real. And Walter realized something as he sat there. He wasn't just trying to save her life. She was saving his. Around 3 in the morning, when the storm outside seemed to lose a little of its fury, the cat stirred. It was barely more than a twitch, the faint movement of a paw, the softest shift of her head. But to Walter, it was a miracle. He leaned in, heart pounding, as her eyes opened wider this time, still glassy but aware. And then it happened. The tiniest sound, a meow so faint it could have been mistaken for a sigh. Walter let out a breath he didn't know he'd been holding, his laugh breaking somewhere in the middle into a sob. He reached out, fingers trembling, and brushed the wet fur on her head. This time she didn't pull away. Instead, in a gesture so small yet so enormous, she pressed her nose, cold, damp, into the curve of his palm. That was it. That was all it took for the dam inside him to burst. 64 years old, and Walter was sitting cross-legged on the floor, crying like a boy, tears sliding down his face unchecked. He hadn't cried when Ellen died. He hadn't cried at the funeral or in the empty nights that followed. But tonight, a 2-pound creature with a heartbeat and a will to live had cracked open everything he had sealed away. He bent over her, whispering through the tears, "You're gonna make it, sweetheart. I promise you, you're gonna make it." But deep down, a cold fear lingered. What if that promise was one he couldn't keep? By dawn, the storm had moved on, leaving behind a landscape that didn't look like the world Walter knew. When he pushed open the door, the air smelled of mud and ruin. The street had become a shallow river, carrying branches, shingles, and shattered fragments of lives that would take months to piece back together. Power lines drooped dangerously, trees lay uprooted, and roofs yawned open like broken mouths. Walter stood there for a long moment, boots sinking into the soggy earth. The little cat, his cat though he didn't dare call her that yet, nestled inside his old jacket against his chest. He could feel the faint warmth of her body, the tiny vibration of her breath. That was what mattered. she was alive. But for how long? She needed food. She needed medicine. She needed things Walter didn't have. The stores were miles away, and from the looks of it, the roads were impassable. His old truck sat half submerged in water, a useless hunk of metal. For a flicker of a second, Walter felt the weight of despair press on him like the storm never had. He'd promised her life, but what if he couldn't deliver? What then? He was still standing there when it happened. A sound, faint at first, then growing louder, the deep, rumbling growl of an engine. Walter turned and saw a truck barreling down the flooded street, tires throwing arcs of dirty water as it fought its way through the muck. For a heartbeat, Walter thought he was imagining it, some cruel trick of hope. But then the truck slowed, brakes squealing, and a man leaned out of the driver's side window. He was young, maybe 30, with a face lined by exhaustion and a jacket plastered to his shoulders from rain. "You stuck?" The man shouted over the roar of water. Walter didn't answer right away. He just clutched the bundle inside his jacket tighter, his mind spinning. He didn't know this man, didn't know where he was headed, or why he was here. All he knew was this: the tiny life against his chest didn't have time for hesitation. So Walter nodded, voice cracking as he called back, "I need a ride, and I need a vet." The man's brows shot up, and for a second, Walter braced for him to laugh, to say no, to drive away. Instead, the stranger smiled, a tired, kind smile, and said the words that would carry them both toward the next chapter of this impossible story. "Hop in." Walter climbed into that truck with his heart pounding and a question echoing in his soul. Who was this man? And why did it feel like fate had just opened a door he didn't even know existed? The truck roared through the broken streets, its tires slicing through waterlogged asphalt as sheets of dirty rainwater splashed against the doors. Walter sat hunched in the passenger seat, the little cat tucked inside his jacket like a heartbeat he couldn't let slip away. Every so often, he pressed a hand against her tiny frame just to feel that faint, precious rhythm, proof she was still holding on. The cab smelled of wet clothes and gasoline, and the wipers thrashed desperately against the windshield, fighting a losing battle against the mist. Beside him, the stranger gripped the wheel with strong, calloused hands, his eyes narrowed on the road ahead. "Name's Jake," he shouted over the growl of the engine. Walter nodded stiffly, the name barely registering. His mind was elsewhere, trapped in the terrifying space between hope and fear. Jake glanced at him and then at the bundle against his chest. "She yours?" he asked, not unkindly. Walter hesitated, staring down at the fragile life in his arms, and for the first time in years, the truth felt simple. "She is now," he said, his voice raw. Jake didn't press. He just gave a quiet nod and focused on driving, while Walter sat there, clinging to a promise he wasn't sure he could keep. As they drove deeper into town, the scale of the storm's fury became impossible to ignore. Houses gutted, their insides spilling into the streets like secrets torn open. Trees sprawled across front yards, roots exposed like veins. A stoplight dangled by a single wire, swaying like a pendulum over the chaos below. Walter stared out the window, his jaw tight, feeling the weight of years pressing on him like wet earth. He thought of Ellen, her laughter echoing in a kitchen that no longer smelled of bread, her voice reading the weather reports out loud in that teasing way that always made him roll his eyes. She would have scolded him for staying through the storm. She would have told him not to take risks. And yet, he could almost hear her whisper now, soft and certain. "Go on, Walter. Don't quit on her." That whisper burned in his chest as the truck rounded a corner and came to a slow, grinding halt. The street ahead was half blocked by a fallen tree, its massive trunk sprawled across the road like a barricade. Jake muttered a curse under his breath and killed the engine. For a moment, there was only silence, the kind that makes your heart stutter. Then he turned to Walter, his expression a mix of frustration and resolve. "We walk from here," Jake said. "You good with that?" Walter looked down at the cat, her breath so faint it almost broke him, and he nodded without hesitation. "Let's go." They climbed out into the mud, boots sinking with every step, the wind still clawing at their clothes even though the worst had passed. Walter clutched the little cat tighter, shielding her from the chill as Jake slung a bag of tools over his shoulder and started down the flooded street. The air smelled of earth and salt and something bitter, loss, maybe, hanging heavy like smoke after a fire. Walter's legs ached almost immediately, his knees protesting every step, but he pushed on, his entire being focused on the fragile weight in his arms. They didn't talk much. What was there to say? Words felt too small against the enormity of what they were walking through. Occasionally, Jake glanced back, offering a hand over a fallen branch or a patch of deep water, and Walter accepted, his pride swallowed by necessity. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked, sharp, urgent, then fell silent, as if even sound had grown weary. Walter's breath came in short, burning bursts, and just when he thought he couldn't take another step, the clinic came into view. It wasn't much, a squat, square building with its windows glowing weakly from a generator's hum, but to Walter, it looked like a cathedral, a place where miracles might still happen. His chest tightened with a rush of relief so fierce it almost buckled his knees. They had made it this far. But as Jake held the door open and Walter stumbled inside, clutching the limp little body like a sacred thing, he knew the hardest part was still to come. The smell hit him first. Antiseptic and wet fur, sharp and sterile, a stark contrast to the mud and ruin outside. The waiting room buzzed with quiet urgency. A couple cradling a small dog wrapped in a blanket. A boy clutching a kitten to his chest, their faces all wearing the same look Walter felt etched into his own, fear tangled with hope. Before he could even speak, a young woman in scrubs hurried over, her eyes flicking from Walter's weathered face to the bundle in his arms. "What happened?" she asked, already reaching for the cat. Walter tried to explain, but the words tangled, breaking under the weight of exhaustion and everything he had carried through that storm. All that came out was, "Please, save her." The woman didn't waste a second. She whisked the little cat away, vanishing behind a swinging door that snapped shut with a finality that made Walter's stomach twist. And just like that, his hands were empty. He stood there for a moment, feeling the absence like a wound, before lowering himself into a chair that groaned under his weight. The room blurred at the edges as fatigue and fear pressed in on him like a tide. He closed his eyes and whispered a prayer he hadn't spoken in decades, his voice cracking on the words. "Please, don't take her away too." Minutes stretched into hours, or maybe they didn't. Time became a cruel, shapeless thing. And then the door opened. The woman emerged, her scrubs streaked with fur and something darker sweat. Maybe or blood he didn't want to think about. For a heartbeat, Walter couldn't read her face. Everything hung on the curve of her mouth, the glint in her tired eyes. And she smiled. Small, quiet, but bright enough to slice through the fog in his mind. "She's going to be okay," she said, her voice gentle as a lullaby. 4 words. That was all. 4 words that cracked open Walter's chest and let the light in. His hands trembled as he covered his face, a sob tearing loose before he could stop it. 64 years old, and he was weeping in a room full of strangers, his body shaking like the storm outside had never ended. When he finally lowered his hands, the woman was gone, and the door was closed again. But the echo of her words pulsed in his ears, steady as a heartbeat. Walter leaned back in the chair, staring at the ceiling as tears blurred the fluorescent lights into halos. For the first time in years, he felt something he thought had died with Ellen. Something he barely recognized at first, because it had been gone so long. Hope. He let out a shaky laugh. Soft, disbelieving, and whispered the name aloud, tasting it like a prayer. Hope. He didn't know then that the name would stick. He didn't know that this little creature wasn't just going to live. She was going to change everything. Because fate had one more twist waiting, one Walter could never have imagined. The clinic smelled different that morning, like sunlight, sneaking through open windows and the faint sweetness of hope after a long storm. Walter walked in with a paper bag of supplies the nurse had asked him to bring. Canned food, a tiny collar, a few toys that looked out of place in his calloused hands. It had been 2 days since the rescue, and each visit made him feel like he was crossing a bridge back to the world of the living. Hope, yes, he was calling her that now, had grown stronger each day. Yesterday, she had batted at his fingers with a paw that no longer trembled, and the sound of her purr had undone him in ways he couldn't explain. Today he was sure she would come home with him. The thought alone filled his chest with a warmth he hadn't felt since Ellen's laughter echoed through their kitchen. He stepped through the door, smiling in a way that felt strange but good, and then he froze, because she was standing there. A young woman, maybe in her mid-20s, her jeans still damp at the hems. A crumpled flyer clutched in her trembling hands. Her face was raw from crying, eyes swollen, but even through the wreckage of grief, she was beautiful in that unguarded, honest way that comes only from heartbreak. And printed on that flyer, in bold black letters under a grainy photo, was a name: Missing. Please help find Bella. Walter's heart plummeted like a stone sinking into deep water. His gaze dropped to the photo, then to the trembling creature in the carrier on the counter. Hope, looking up at him with those same green eyes that had pulled him back from the edge of his own darkness. And in that instant, the world tilted. She wasn't his. She belonged to someone else. Someone who had been searching, praying, just like he had. The woman turned, her voice breaking as she asked the question that shattered him completely. Sir, have you seen this cat? Walter couldn't speak at first. His throat locked up, his chest heaving with the weight of 1,000 things he couldn't say. He wanted to tell her everything about the storm, the rope, the night he thought he'd lose her, the way that tiny heartbeat had stitched his own back together. But all that came out was a sound rough and low as he stepped forward and handed her the flyer back with shaking fingers. The truth clawed at him like the wind that had torn his world apart just days ago. She had a claim, and it was stronger than his longing. She was family to this woman, and family was something Walter knew too well to steal. The nurse must have sensed the fracture in the air because she came forward, speaking softly, explaining what had happened, how Walter had found the cat chained to a post in the middle of hell. The woman's hands flew to her mouth, her eyes brimming with tears as she whispered, "Chained? Oh my God, who would do that?" Her voice cracked, breaking open a silence heavy with gratitude and guilt. Walter stood there, staring at Hope, Bella, and for the first time in years, his knees felt weak. Because giving her up now felt like losing Ellen all over again. And yet, wasn't love about sacrifice? Wasn't it about doing what was right, even when it tears you apart? He bent down slowly, sliding his hand through the bars of the carrier. And Hope pressed her nose against his fingers like she had that first night, as if to say thank you. Walter swallowed hard, forcing his voice past the ache in his throat. "She's yours," he whispered. But before the words could settle, the young woman shook her head. "I don't know if I can take her," she said, her voice trembling like the wings of a trapped bird. Walter blinked, his mind reeling. "What do you mean?" The woman clutched the flyer to her chest, her shoulders shaking as the truth spilled out in broken fragments. She had fled during the storm, her house ripped open by the wind, everything gone in the flood. She was living in a shelter now, no home, no certainty of when life would start again. "I came because I needed to know she was alive," she said, her tears falling like rain onto the paper in her hands. "I can't give her what she needs right now." Her voice cracked on the last word, and for a moment, the room held nothing but the sound of two hearts breaking in different ways. Walter stared at the hollow hunger in her eyes, the hunger of someone who had lost everything and was too proud to ask for more. And in that instant, something inside him shifted. He realized this wasn't just a story about rescue. It was a story about grace. About two people brought together by a storm and a small, fierce life that refused to quit. Walter took a step closer, his voice steady now, carrying the strength he didn't know he still had. "Now let me take care of her," he said softly. "Just until you're ready. She'll be yours when the time comes." For a long, fragile moment, the woman just stared at him, her lips parted, her breath catching like wind in a broken sail. Then she nodded, tears sliding down her cheeks as relief and gratitude softened her features. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible but heavy with meaning. And just like that, the weight in Walter's chest lifted, replaced by something light and bright and terrifying in its beauty. Hope wasn't leaving. Not yet. Maybe not ever. Walter crouched beside the carrier, sliding the latch open, and the little cat stepped into his arms like she had always belonged there, pressing her face against his chest with a purr that rumbled like distant thunder. Not the storm that had nearly taken her, but the quiet, promising kind that brings rain to thirsty ground. As he stood there, cradling her against his heart, Walter realized something he hadn't felt in years. The future didn't scare him anymore. The road ahead might be long and the world might still be broken in places. But as long as there was breath in his lungs and warmth in this small body curled against him, there would be life. There would be love. And there would always be hope. Even in the darkest storms, when life feels like it's tearing everything apart, the smallest spark of kindness can light a fire big enough to guide us home. Sometimes that spark comes on 4 paws,